Okay, part 3 of our Old English contexts lecture. We're getting into the what's called the Old English period now, and we're talking about an Old English is the language that was spoken. This is sometimes referred to as the Old English period. Sometimes it's referred to as the Anglo-Saxon period, because the two principal tribes were Angles and Saxons. And this is becoming an increasingly controversial term. Last week we talked about how the term Aryan had been ruined by Nazis, and the term Anglo-Saxon also has some unpleasant associations. People associated with the Ku Klux Klan will speak glowingly of our Anglo-Saxon heritage, by which they mean, whites. And so we like to use the term Old English when we can, but it's hard. Sometimes you want to talk about the material and political culture rather than the language, and then the term Anglo-Saxon is more clearly comprehensive of all these things. So, what about Old English? We're getting a little bit into the language here. It's an Indo-European language, it's Germanic, it's Low West Germanic, it is Old English, and it is the language that is spoken, not without change, between 450 and 1150 in the Common Era. We have identified 4 basic dialects of Old English. Northumbrian, that's what's spoken up here. North of the Humber, that's the Humber River. So Bede uses the term, the first person we see to use the word Northumbria, and some believe that he made it up, but we don't know. But this is Northumbria. Then there's Mercian. And the word Mercian is related to an old word for border. And the word march, as in the Scottish marches or the Welsh marches, is based on this, as well as the word mark. A marker is where a border is. And the word marquis was actually, in French, the aristocratic title was somebody who ruled a border area. And so Mercia is related to this word. Kentish was one of the more highly populated areas, especially in the early Old English period. It was one of the oldest parts that was settled by Angles and Saxons, and it's just this corner here. What is today the area of England known as Kent, and it's where Canterbury is. Canterbury, Cantaburga, being the Old English word for the fortified town of the Kents. That's what Canterbury means. And Wessex, is this area here, and there they spoke West Saxon. So Northumbria, Mercia, Kent, and Wessex are where Northumbrian, Mercian, Kentish, and West Saxon are written. Now, Mercia is fairly large, and actually, sometimes people identify a 5th dialect called Anglian, but that's usually can be divided either between Northumbrian and Mercian. This area here is Anglia, East Anglia. Now, we don't have that much evidence of Northumbrian or Kentish. We have a little bit more of Mercian, where we find that it's preserved in charters, which is to say deeds, contracts, property deeds, inscriptions, often in stone. Sometimes you have inscriptions in stone crosses. Our oldest copy of The Dream of the Rood, which is one of your group activity texts, is on the stone cross in Mercia, and other fragmentary evidence. But most of the Old English that survives, which is vastly more than what survives for many other early Germanic languages, is West Saxon. It has the most surviving manuscripts. West Saxon produced the literary standard. If you should take ENG491 with me this fall and study Old English, the version learned when you study will be West Saxon. And we'll talk about why that is for a bit. But first we want to talk about the political map here. These are England was not unified in the early days. There was the early Saxon kingdoms of Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, and Wessex. And Essex and Wessex are, of course, based on the East Saxons and West Saxons. And these kingdoms, while they were busy fighting wars with the Celts, such as Gwynedd, Powys, and Dyfed, were also fighting wars with each other. even as they didn't all become Christian at once. Sometimes you had a group of Christian Anglos and Saxons fighting against what we might call pagan Anglos and Saxons. That's a word you have to remember that comes from Roman, and it meant just like heathen or hathana in Old English, somebody from the countryside. Because in early Christianity, Christianity was a religion that spread through trade routes, and so it was concentrated in the cities. So the Christian religion spread and was practiced in cities long before it was in the country. So paganus, which had long ago in Roman times meant like country person, hic, rube, came to be a person who worshipped the old gods rather than the Judeo-Christian or the Christian God. So all of this was England before 793, roughly speaking. 793 is the cataclysmic beginning of the Viking invasions. Now, when we talk about Vikings, what we're talking about are Danes and other what were called Northmen or Norsemen. And some of these Northmen went down and conquered parts of France where they became the Normans or the Normans or the Northmen. And they took pretty quickly to the French language and became Francified. And we'll hear about the Normans next week. But what happened was the Vikings basically devastated old Anglo-Saxon society and ended up conquering a lot of Britain. Some speculate that Old English might have died out, and Britain have become a sort of appendage of Denmark and Danish culture. But one kingdom survived. If you have Netflix, there's a fun show about this. I'm not vouching for its historical accuracy, but it's about Alfred, the king of Wessex, who managed to not be defeated by the Danes and fight the Danish back to a truce, and convinced their king Guthrum to convert to Christianity. And so a large part of England became known as the Danelaw. And this is the part that was ruled by Danes. And then these two other kingdoms survived, Wessex and its dependencies, and Northumbria. But it was Wessex that, when the Danes were finally pushed out and defeated, became the foundation of a unified England that was had actually one of the most centralized and sophisticated cultures in Western Europe, which made it, in 1066, ripe pickings for the Normans, who would invade and have a single country that they could knock over and install themselves at the head of. So this is the political map here after 878, which is the year of the treaty that Alfred signed with King Guthrum. Okay, so a little bit about, we're going to talk about Alfred a bit more because he's a pretty important guy, not just in political, but in linguistic history of in literary history of Old English, but just a little bit about Old English society. Some of these are features that Old English society shared with other Germanic and early Indo-European societies. They lived in tribal groups with a high class of warriors and a common class of laborers. And the higher class of warriors in Old English were known as earls, and the common laborers were known as ceorlas. And so that CE is pronounced ch in Old English. So if you have ever heard the term churl or churlish, as in grumpy or mean or coarse or rude, this is a reflex of this Old English term. We also have the Norse terms jarl and carl that are similar to this. If any of you play a certain Elder Scrolls game, you'll have encountered these terms before. The Nord society in Skyrim is kind of a fictional pastiche of Anglo-Saxon and early Norse culture. They came to call their common language English or Anglish, perhaps to distinguish it from the Saxons still spoken, perhaps because Bede called them the Anglorum, perhaps because even though they might distinguish among themselves between the Danes and the between Saxons and Jutes and this and that. There are other people from other parts of Europe, called them English all alike. And you might compare this to the discussion of Yankee and who gets called a Yankee within or inside or outside of the United States that Lear talks about. They became Christian gradually at first and then quickly, but they still valued heroic ideals and traditional heroes. The poetry that survives, like Beowulf, that celebrates this tradition is overlaid with a thick layer of Christian moralizing, and there's often an efforts to sort of integrate Christian and heroic, aristocratic value, like noble values. And this is, of course, characteristic of, Western European culture from the time of the Christianization of the Germanic peoples all the way through the early modern period. They valued family, virtue, storytelling, and togetherness. They feared humiliation and loneliness. This is something that we can piece together from their literature, from their sermons, and in this they're not dissimilar from a lot of people. But one thing I will say, in my opinion, Old English culture, such as survives from the Anglo-Saxon period, is not a kind of really, they're not really funny very often. Correct me if I'm wrong, but if they're funny, they have a very dry sense of humor. There tends to be a kind of bleakness about their work. They have simple buildings and clothes, but elaborate and sophisticated metalwork. You put your effort into the things that survive and last, and you can hand down to your ancestors, and that you can give out to your warriors to consolidate your ties with them. While they're speaking Old English and developing oral formulaic poetry, such as Seth Lear talks about, Latin is being maintained by monks in monasteries, and monasteries were the centers of learning and culture, and they were the ones that preserved Anglo-Saxon texts. And a great deal of the Anglo-Saxon texts that were preserved were done so under the direction of King Alfred the Great. Here's a coin printed in his reign, the only British monarch with the epithet the Great, so that should say something. He stopped the Danish expansion and saved English political independence. Maybe this is a little bit hero-making, but that's the kind of received story. I'm sure that specialists will quibble about this or that. He negotiated the boundaries of Wessex and Danish territory. We talked about that already. But here's the important thing. He reformed education and made English a language of culture and learning. He restored London as the English capital, and basically was all around important. And because he fostered this cultural program of producing, copying texts in English, we have texts that survive from all over English from centuries. And England continued to be a written language even after the French-speaking Normans invaded it and basically dispossessed the English-speaking ruling class. We have Anglo-Saxon chronicles that continue to be written, histories, sermons, translations of the Bible, sometimes translations of the Bible into Old English heroic style verse, where Exodus is written, or Genesis are written like Beowulf in the same poetic meter, but with Christian themes. It's a really fascinating culture, and one that I'll be teaching about in 598. And you could take a much deeper dive. And of course, this week's group activities are meant to both introduce you to the language, but to give you a broad cross-section of the kind of texts that were produced and which survive from the Old English period. So enjoy.